So we recently did a collaboration at MSK looking at the CURB trial, more specifically the non-small cell lung cancer cohort who received SBRT for oligoprogression. And the key finding from that study was that the sum of longest diameters of growing lesions, which is the amount of lesions that were, I guess, the burden of lesions that were growing at the time of oligoprogression, was the tumor burden metric that was most strongly associated with outcomes. We used a median cutoff, the sum of longest diameter of growing lesions less than or equal to 4 cm, identified patients who had markedly longer progression-free survival and overall survival than a sum of longest diameter of growing lesions greater than 4 cm. In terms of actually quantifying the differences, this is a difference in progression-free survival that is like over 20 months difference. And so why did we focus on growing lesions? So actually at the time when we thought of this secondary analysis of the CURB trial, we wanted to see which tumor burdens were most prognostic of PFS and OS, because typically a lot of people assume that it's just the number of progressing lesions. So we wanted to do a systematic approach looking at not only the number of progressing lesions, the number of all lesions in patients, but look at the volume, the sum of longest diameter of all lesions, sum of longest diameter of progressive lesions, and apply univariable and multivariable analyses to objectively ascertain which is the most meaningful metric and most impactful from a prognostic standpoint. And the purpose of doing such a thing would be to, in the future, if validated in future studies, stratify decision-making by the sum of longest diameter of growing lesions or the volumetric tumor burden in oligoprogression. Because if you look at our data, even just glancing at the swimmer plot, there's a marked difference in terms of if you had a sum of longest diameter of growing lesions less than 4 centimeters, most people were certainly living beyond a year, but not even progressing until more than a year after treatment, while people with greater volumetric tumor burden were progressing and dying within a year, most patients. So if a patient has a lower volumetric tumor burden of progressive disease, perhaps SBRT to progressing sites, which is like SBRT, stereotactic body radiotherapy, high dose radiation delivered over less than or equal to 5 treatments, delivering that to progressive sites and continuing on current systemic therapy could be a viable option. However, patients with a greater volumetric tumor burden of progressive disease, in addition to SBRT to the progressive lesions, considering intensifying or switching systemic therapy or a trial would be, I guess, based on our data, it would make sense and be justified. But I guess one thing I would like to clarify, because this has come up, although we wanted to have relatively evenly balanced groups, and that's how we came up with this cutoff of 4 centimeters, I believe that this really occurs along a spectrum. So the lower your volumetric tumor burden and progressive lesions, I suspect that the probability of SBRT plus current systemic therapy being effective is just higher. But as you get to have a larger sum of longest diameters of growing lesions or volumetric tumor burden of growing lesions, the probability of SBRT to growing lesions alone being effective is just going to progressively go down. And so, although to really demonstrate the relationship graphically categorical variable. I think that this is something that will exist along a spectrum, and that patients will have to go over with their physicians in terms of identifying which approach is optimal for treating their oligoprogressive non-small cell lung cancer. So for this study, the next thing we're doing is looking at circulating tumor DNA and seeing how that correlates with both the sum of longest diameter of growing lesions as well as the volumetric tumor burden. So rather than summing up the longest diameter of each lesion in a patient and each growing lesion in a patient, actually doing a volumetric measurement. And so we want to have a more comprehensive characterization of tumor burden, particularly in these progressive lesions, because I think technology like auto-segmentation will allow us to leverage AI to accurately quantify in the most objective means possible the tumor burden, both the overall but also progressive lesions, because it seems the tumor burden of progressive lesions is the most meaningful from a prognostic standpoint for progression-free survival and overall survival. And it would always be great if we could have a peripheral blood assay like circulating tumor DNA measurements to be able to give patients results that could be meaningful for helping decide which therapy is optimal for them. And we'd like to validate this in a larger data set too. We're working on that. And should also say the CURB-2 trial is enrolling. Dr. Sai, who was the PI of the CURB trial, and she's been working closely with us on the secondary analysis. She's leading a randomized phase 3 trial that's studying this question of specifically if adding SBRT to first-line treatment or starting new second-line therapy in the setting of non-small cell oligoprogression, which of those arms is going to have the best outcomes. And there's co-primary endpoints of progression-free survival and overall survival.